Let's start this second session where we're going to look at the actual compassion practice. But first, in this session, we'll start with a meditation on some ways of dealing with attachment. So continuing on our discussion of attachment from the last session. Then following the meditation, dispelling some misconceptions regarding attachment. Then we'll follow that with a short review of some of the main points from the first session. Then we'll introduce the actual compassion practice. We'll do a meditation on compassion, and then some tips for that practice. And then in conjunction with compassion practice, we'll look at anger and how to deal with anger, and time for question answer at the end of the session as per normal. So let's go straight to the meditation. Meditation on looking at some ways of dealing with attachment. Find a nice comfortable posture. Let's begin. We begin by establishing a good posture, keeping the back nice and straight, and at the same time allow the entire body to become completely relaxed. Allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. And with each out breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. And simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Allowing the mind to remain relaxed, still, and clear. Let's now have a look at some ways of dealing with attachment. Remember, attachment is a mental factor that sees its object as attractive. It then exaggerates the object's attractiveness and thus wishes to possess and hold it. Why? because attachment believes that object is a source of our happiness. Let's begin by bringing to mind a specific person or thing that seems to be crucial to your happiness. And then imagine you've actually got hold of that person or thing, holding on tightly, not wanting to lose that person or thing. And try to picture the scene clearly. How do you feel? Is your mind relaxed and calm? Does that person or thing have the power to bring you the lasting happiness that you seek? Now mentally relax your grip on that person or thing you're attached to, allowing it to just be, allowing some space. How do you feel? More relaxed and calm? Without the clinging, are you more able to enjoy the presence of that person or thing? And again, allow some attachment to that person or thing to arise. Now, instead of focusing on your object of attachment, look directly at the attachment itself. What is the nature of the attachment? Is it something solid and concrete? Or does it change over time? Look closely. And if we look directly at attachment itself in this way, does it have any power over us? Do we need to fight with it? Or does it simply start to dissolve? Now recall that the person or thing you're attached to is impermanent, changing from moment to moment, in a constant state of change, not remaining the same from one moment to the next, constantly changing. In seeing this, check whether your attachment towards that person or thing remains the same. Now imagine that person or thing changing over time and becoming very old. And again, check whether your attachment remains the same. And again, imagine the person or thing you're attached to clearly in front of you. What is it exactly that makes that person or thing so desirable, so attractive? So mentally dissect that person or thing into its parts and try to pinpoint exactly what it is that is so attractive, so desirable. Now try to think of someone who might not see that person or thing as pleasing or attractive. Is their perception invalid? Are you seeing that person or thing in a correct way while they are mistaken? Or is it that due to your own experience, you are correctly labeling that person or thing as pleasing or attractive? And that due to the other person having a completely different experience, they are correctly labeling that person or thing in a totally different way. And that due to your labeling that person or thing as attractive, are you then going on to seeing that person or thing as inherently attractive, attractive from its own side? And as a result, do you develop some attachment, thinking that that person or thing is the source of your happiness? Nothing is inherently one way or another. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And by understanding this, then whether it is a relationship with another person or simply eating a delicious piece of chocolate cake, we won't cling to that experience. And as a result, we will enjoy the experience more fully. And so in conclusion, recognize that it is possible to practice these methods of letting go of attachment, and that when we do, we'll feel more balanced and free to enjoy things without clinging, and more balanced and free to enjoy and improve our relationships with others, and make a strong determination to do so. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Let's now have a look at some common misconceptions regarding attachment. One is that often people feel like I need attachment to enjoy things. That if I get rid of attachment, my life would become very bland and boring because I'll just become detached from everything. That's a misconception. Attachment actually interferes with our enjoyment of the simple pleasures in life. And we know this well, that if we have particularly strong craving and attachment, that already agitates our mind. And it often leads to a lot of fear and worry about not getting it, not getting enough of it, losing it, frustration when we don't get it, overindulging when we do get it, dissatisfaction, disappointment when it doesn't live up to our expectations, and simply just end up more craving because we think we need more of it. And as I said earlier, that craving and attachment causes us to actually stop enjoying the things we used to enjoy. And we know this well as well, that if we have something we like and we get it too often, then it doesn't take too many times of getting that thing when suddenly a craving and attachment says, sorry, not good enough anymore. I need something bigger, better, and different. Never satisfied. Whereas if we let go of craving and attachment, we'll actually enjoy the simple pleasures in life much more. And I've got a concrete example here from my own experience. Many years ago, when I did my first long meditation retreat, I was in a retreat center in Spain on the side of a mountain, had a nice little retreat cabin, and they were supplying a basket of food every day nearby. The food was quite nutritious, but it tended to be quite repetitive, the same menu. And we know from our own experience, even if it's food we like, if we eat it day in, day out, the same food, it doesn't take too many days of eating the same food. We go, oh, not that again, even if we initially enjoyed it. But my experience was completely opposite. After about a month of eating the same food, it started tasting better. And initially I thought the cook must be putting more effort into the cooking. But then a couple more weeks went by and it kept tasting better. And then after about 6 or 7 weeks, I realized this is exactly the same food as 6 weeks ago. What's changed? And what had changed was that due to being in meditation retreat, my mind was calming down. My craving and attachment was subsiding. And so I was actually starting to enjoy the food much more. And I can honestly say at that time, I had never, ever enjoyed food so much before in my life. And it was nothing special. I mean, it was nutritious, but it tasted so nice. And there was not really any craving for it. I just enjoyed that pleasurable taste. And also I was in a cabin on the side of a mountain, a big spacious view, Mediterranean in the distance. And again, if we go to a place with a nice view, after a few days of being there, we don't even notice the view anymore. My experience is the view kept getting more and more beautiful. And then also little things, little insignificant flowers started to become more and more beautiful. And wow, that's so beautiful. And so my experience of the environment was more beauty. Because of less attachment, I was enjoying it much more. And here also, when we talk about letting go of attachment, we're not talking about becoming detached. That's not the same thing. In fact, the two extremes that we're stuck in now is attachment, meaning trying to hold on to pleasurable things, thinking they're the source of our happiness, or detachment, meaning splitting from things because we see they seem to be the source of our suffering. So we detach because they give us a lot of suffering. So both of those arise from a distorted view of reality, attachment and detachment, seeing that the source of happiness and suffering is out there in the world. The middle way is non-attachment. That is, being fully engaged in the world with enjoying things without attachment. And this arises from the correct view of reality, understanding the source of happiness and suffering lies within our own mind. When this is explained, then people go, okay, maybe actually attachment does interfere with my enjoyment of the simple pleasures in life. Maybe that's true. However, I need attachment to have a relationship. Without attachment, there would be no basis for a relationship. And here I think the part of the confusion is the way it's defined. That the way attachment is defined in Buddhism and psychology is not really the same. In fact, here I have a definition of attachment in psychology. Attachment is a deep and enduring emotional bond that connects one person to another across time and space. So often in psychology, we talk about attachment theory, where they talk about healthy forms of attachment, such as a strong bond between mother and child that we need to actively cultivate. Of course, there are unhealthy versions that we need to eliminate. But in Buddhism, remember, attachment is defined as a mental factor that sees its object as attractive. It exaggerates the object's attractiveness, thus wishes to possess and hold the object, believing that is a source of our happiness. And so therefore, in a relationship, there are two dynamics going on. There's the healthy dynamic of love or loving kindness and the unhealthy dynamic of attachment. And we need to be able to distinguish these two and increase loving kindness and decrease attachment. And so love or loving kindness in a relationship is the wish for them to be happy. The fine print is without expecting anything in return, what we would call unconditional love, no strings attached love. Conditional love or strings attached love is love polluted by attachment. And that sounds like this: I will love you as long as, and here comes the condition, as long as you keep saying and doing things that make me happy. Otherwise, no. So that's all attachment speaking. So the way to distinguish between love or loving kindness and attachment is love or loving kindness is saying, I want you to be happy. Attachment is saying, I want you to make me happy. So attachment's all about me, 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 me. And in a relationship, actually attachment sees the other person as an object to satisfy me. So not very nice. So if we can distinguish these two dynamics, increase loving kindness, decrease attachment as much as possible, our relationships will improve. And then when that's explained, people go, that might be true. Let me check that out. But yet I still need attachment. I need attachment to be creative. That's another misconception. Now, no one is doubting the fact that mental afflictions like craving, attachment, jealousy, anger, and so forth provide a lot of fuel for creativity. But here we're not talking about the subject matter, we're talking about the source of creativity. And the source of creativity is coming from deep within our own mind. And as long as our mind is contaminated, agitated by mental afflictions such as attachment, we are actually suffocating our creativity. So if we reduce and eliminate mental afflictions such as attachment, then that opens a space for creativity to manifest. And now often our creativity is a little bit selfish in terms of, look at me, how wonderful a musician I am, or how wonderful an artist I am. Whereas if we can reduce and eliminate mental afflictions, not only will we become more creative, we'll become more creative for a more meaningful reason. I think the truly great creative people are the ones who use their creative talents to inspire others for a good purpose. And so in summary, if we reduce and eliminate our attachment, we'll enjoy simple pleasures in life much more, our relationships will improve, will improve, and our creativity will increase. We'll become more creative. So it's a win-win-win situation. Let's now do a short review before we go on to compassion practice. And so we saw here that there are two main wings of practice in Buddhist traditions, wisdom and compassion. Here in this weekend, we're focusing on the compassion wing. At the foundation level, they are the four immeasurables practices, which we're looking at today. And then tomorrow we'll move on to look at the Bodhicitta in terms of exchanging self with others, where we really focus a lot on self-cherishing and cherishing others. So the four immeasurables are the foundation. The exchanging self with others is a technique or approach to cultivate bodhicitta. So that's building on the foundation of the four immeasurables. And we've just looked at now how to deal with attachment. And now we're going to also look at how to deal with anger, as these are obstacles to this practice, the compassion practice. And the last session tomorrow, also how to integrate all of these various practices into daily life. And here we saw that loving kindness is the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to have happiness in its causes. And so if we want to cultivate loving kindness, then we need to know what is happiness, what are the causes of happiness, and how to cultivate those causes. And so if we can understand there are two types of happiness, the pleasure and genuine happiness, inner well-being, and what are the causes of this genuine happiness, inner well-being, in terms of these three higher trainings of ethics, concentration, and wisdom. And then we cultivate those through ethical behavior, through shamatha and vipassana practice. Then understanding all of those things, then we can really start to cultivate an aspiration for ourselves and others to have happiness in its causes. And we saw there in terms of loving kindness, we cultivate that in stages, start with ourselves first, and then move out to friends, strangers, difficult people, and eventually to all living beings. This is called immeasurable loving kindness. So that's a short review of loving kindness. Let's go now and talk a little bit about attachment again, summarize that before we go into compassion. So attachment here is what's called the near enemy of loving kindness. It's the one that interferes with loving kindness, pollutes and corrupts it. And we saw there that attachment rather is really seeing the object as attractive, exaggerates the object as attractiveness, then wishes to possess and hold it, believing that object is the source of our happiness. And now we just had a look at that. Letting go of attachment doesn't mean becoming detached from everything. Rather, it's non-attachment, meaning rather fully being present in the world of experience without attachment, enjoying simple pleasures in life. And we just looked at how to dispelling some misconceptions regarding attachment. And we saw in the last session how to deal with attachment. First, to have a clear understanding of attachment, how it doesn't bring us any happiness, it just brings us suffering, therefore to develop the aspiration to be free of it. And if we cultivate that view of genuine happiness through preliminary practices, then we won't be chasing after the sense pleasures, because we'll understand the source of happiness is coming within our own mind. And then actually how to deal with attachment when it's arising. First point is we need mindfulness, to simply be aware when it first arises, before it takes control of our mind. Here then the importance of having engaged in shamatha practice, of cultivating mindfulness, strengthening mindfulness, so that we can simply observe attachment when it's arising. And if we can observe it, we're not caught up in it, we're free of it, and it'll simply dissolve. We don't need to fight with it. It can't harm us. It can't do anything. And then in addition to mindfulness, we saw that we can then apply antidotes to attachment, particularly coming from the wisdom or vipassana wing of practice. Through impermanence, by seeing everything as a flow, changing moment by moment, nothing for attachment to grab hold of. And then through the wisdom of emptiness, coming to experientially realize that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is not there objectively in the object, and thereby we'll be able to let go of attachment. And that now brings us to the actual compassion practice. Again, we've got this quote here from Shantideva. The relevant part here is the first sentence. Those desiring to escape from suffering hasten right toward their own misery. So we have a desire to be free of suffering, but we often just create more suffering. But let's have a look first. What is compassion? Compassion in Sanskrit and Pali is karuna, and it's defined as the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. And so what we see here is that, like loving kindness, compassion here, as it's defined in Buddhism, is not an emotion. The emotion that comes with compassion is empathy. And it's empathy that precedes compassion. It's the emotion of empathy that is the precursor for compassion. I want to talk a little bit more about that later as well. And as we saw earlier as well here, we tend to already have a desire to be free of suffering, but it's often misdirected. And as Shanti Deva said, therefore, desiring to escape from suffering, we hasten right toward our own misery. We just create more suffering because we don't know what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, and how to eliminate them. Therefore, to be able to cultivate this compassion, this aspirational wish, we need to know what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, and how to eliminate those causes. If we don't know those three things, again, compassion is simply words with no meaning. Let's briefly look at those 3 points now then. Firstly, what is suffering? Normally, when we hear the word suffering, that for us normally implies some sort of unpleasant, painful physical or mental experience. And yes, we definitely want to be free of that. But here in Buddhism, when we're cultivating compassion, the wish to be free of suffering and its causes, it's much more than the wish of simply wanting to be free of unpleasant experiences. Because here the word suffering, the original Sanskrit term and Pali term is dukkha. And dukkha literally means bad space or bad hole, meaning something's not quite right. And to understand this word dukkha, which has a much broader meaning than simply unpleasant experiences, we can talk about 3 types or 3 levels of dukkha. The first is the dukkha of suffering. This is talking about our unpleasant experiences. So this is very obvious. This is something we want to be free of. That's for sure. But then at a deeper level, we can talk about the dukkha of change. And that is referring to our pleasant experiences. This is not so obvious, this one, because actually we normally identify pleasant experiences as happiness. And so we end up with craving and attachment to our pleasant experiences. And therefore we end up often with a lot of unnecessary suffering because of that craving and attachment. But if we can realize that these pleasant experiences are not the source of our happiness, then we can let go of the craving and attachment to the pleasant experiences, be free of that craving and attachment. But there's something deeper going on than simply pleasant and unpleasant experiences. And that is that the human condition is such that no matter where we are, no matter what we're doing, there's always a potential for suffering to arise in our life. This is called all-pervasive dukkha. Means our life is pervaded by the potential for suffering to arise. And this is the most subtle understanding. Why is that potential for suffering to arise always there, always present? Is because our mind is contaminated by the mental afflictions. As long as we have craving, attachment, jealousy, anger, fear, anxiety, and so forth in our mind, there's always a potential for suffering to arise in our life. So this is the deepest level of compassion, to wish to be free of even this potential for suffering to arise. So this is when we talk about the wish to be free of suffering and its causes, not just to be free of unpleasant experiences, not just to be free of attachment to pleasant, but to be free of even the potential for suffering to arise in our life. What are the causes of suffering? The cause of suffering is not anywhere out there. It lies within our own mind. It's the mental afflictions, condensed down to these 3 main poisons called the 3 main mental afflictions called the 3 poisons. Again, the first, ignorance, our distorted view of reality. At the deepest level, we see those 4 distorted views. the deepest level of our distorted view of reality is that we see things which are dependent as independent. We're grasping onto an independent me, an independent objective world. And then from that, then when we encounter something pleasant, believing it's independent of us, we'll naturally assume that the beauty is there, that that's the cause of my pleasant experience. Therefore, I want that because I want pleasant experiences. So we end up with attachment to those objects. Or if we experience something unpleasant, I don't like unpleasant experiences, that thing there seems to be the cause of my unpleasant experience. Get it out of here, aversion. And then all other mental afflictions come out of those two, and that's driving our behavior. So we looked at attachment last session, and we did a meditation on dealing with attachment in this session, earlier this session. Now, a little bit later in this session, we're going to look at aversion in terms of anger. Anger is a very strong type of aversion that really causes a lot of problems. So we need to address that. And so we'll begin to look at that this session and continue that next session. How do we eliminate the causes? How do we eliminate those mental afflictions which are the cause of suffering? And here we have a quote from Nagarjuna. And he says, by extinguishing actions and mental afflictions, there is liberation. Actions and mental afflictions arise from misconceptions, and misconceptions arise from elaborations. Elaborations will cease through cultivating emptiness. Here, elaborations is another word for ignorance, for grasping to independent existence. So that grasping to independent existence leads to misconceptions that the source of happiness and suffering is out there. That's leading to craving, attachment, aversion, all the other mental afflictions, driving our behavior, leading to suffering. So therefore, we need to go back to the root, which is ignorance. And we can cease that through cultivating emptiness, through the Vipassana practice of emptiness. And so if we understand that, then we understand what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, how to eliminate those causes. Then we can actually cultivate genuine compassion for ourselves, the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be liberated from all suffering and its causes. And as with loving kindness, here with compassion, we cultivate again through similar stages. Classic in the text, 4 stages mentioned: friends, strangers, enemies, and then out to all living beings, which is immeasurable compassion. But again, I think in our modern society, we need to add one more step at the beginning, that is cultivate compassion for ourselves, because often we don't feel very compassionate towards ourselves, even in fact have self-hatred, low self-esteem. So that's where we need to start and then expand out from there. And that's what we're going to do now. As similar to the loving kindness, we're going to do a compassion meditation, first cultivating compassion for ourselves, and then expanding out through friend, stranger, enemy, and so forth. Find a nice, comfortable posture. Let's begin that meditation. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. Using the out-breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. and relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. And with each out-breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. Releasing all activities of the mind and simply allowing the mind to come to rest. To come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. Compassion is the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. And we can begin by cultivating compassion for ourselves and then expanding out to others. And again, we can begin by imagining the inner purity of our mind, a level of our mind untouched by any of the mental afflictions. To imagine this inner purity of your mind in the form of a small, white, radiant sphere of light at the center of your chest, at the level of your heart. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if I were free of suffering and its causes. May I be free of all suffering and its causes. May I be free of all mental afflictions. And then imagine all your mental afflictions and suffering in the form of black smoke filling your body. And then with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing your mental afflictions and suffering at your heart, dissolving it into your inner wisdom, inner purity. And then imagine the black cloud is completely extinguished. And now you're completely free of all mental afflictions and suffering. And simply rest in that freedom, rest in that purity of mind. And just as you wish to be free of suffering, so does everyone else. And so next, bring to mind someone close to you, a loved one, who's currently experiencing some sort of physical or mental problem or suffering. And imagine them very clearly in front of you. And arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they're free of that problem, free of that suffering. May you be free of all suffering and its causes. And then imagine their problem or suffering in the form of black smoke filling their body. And then with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke out of their body and bringing it into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart. And imagine the black cloud is now completely extinguished. And now they're completely free of that problem, free of that suffering. And take delight in this. And again, next, bring to mind someone who you know well, but is neither friend nor someone who you dislike. And imagine them very clearly in front of you. They're just like yourself in wanting to be free of suffering. And so arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they're free of suffering and its causes. May you be free of all suffering and its causes. May you be free of all mental afflictions. And imagine their mental afflictions and suffering in the form of black smoke filling their body. And with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke out of their body and bringing it into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. And so with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart. Imagine the black cloud is now completely extinguished. And now they're completely free of all mental afflictions and suffering. And take delight in this. And then next bring to mind a difficult person, someone who you dislike. And again, imagine them very clearly in front of you. They are also just like yourself in wanting to be free of suffering. And so arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they were free of suffering and its causes. May you be free of all suffering and its causes. May you be free of all mental afflictions. And imagining their mental afflictions and suffering in the form of black smoke filling their body. And with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their mental afflictions and suffering at your heart. And then imagine they're now completely free of all mental afflictions and suffering. And take joy in this. And then release all appearances and allow the mind to come to rest. To rest in that inner purity of mind, which is in the nature of compassion. Just rest in that compassion. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Just a few tips for this practice. So as with the loving kindness, it's helpful to start here with oneself. Again, particularly if we're suffering from low self-esteem or even self-hatred. And once we start to expand out to others, we can again focus on individuals or even groups of people. Again, how to cultivate for difficult people, because often we feel like if they have really done a lot of bad things, then we feel like they don't even deserve compassion. So the problem here is what's called cognitive fusion, and we'll be looking at that in the beginning of the next session. And again, if you find visualization difficult, the smoke or the person or whatever, then that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is simply wishing for them to be free of that suffering. So instead of visualizing, if you don't find it helpful, just repeat that mental aspiration on every in-breath. May you be free of suffering and its causes. May you be free of suffering and its causes. May you be free of mental afflictions. And then in terms of the obstacles to compassion, again, in terms of what's called the far enemy, near enemy. Far enemy is what's directly opposite. Directly opposite of wishing them to be free of suffering is wishing them to actually suffer cruelty. We'll be in that context, we'll be looking at how to deal with anger. The near enemy, there's two, I think here, there's two. There's one is despair, is that if we're focusing too much on suffering, we get overwhelmed and we sort of end up in this feeling of despair. And so one remedy for that is to focus also on the positive aspects of ourselves and others, to have a balanced perspective. And so that's empathetic joy. We'll look at that in the next session. But also another near enemy, something that seems like compassion, is pity. And pity, I think, is when we see people suffering and we pity them, we're sort of putting ourselves a little bit above them, you know, poor you, I'm okay, but poor you. And so this putting ourselves above others is a little bit this sort of selfish motivation. And so we'll be looking at how to deal with that in session 5 tomorrow, the second session, in terms of exchanging self with others. So that'll come up tomorrow. Now let's have a look at anger. And so in the context of compassion, anger in Sanskrit is pratiga, and in Pali very similar, patiga. And anger, like attachment, is a mental affliction, a klesha. And anger is defined, and anger is a very strong type of aversion. Anger is defined as a mental factor that sees its object as unattractive. It exaggerates the object's unattractiveness and thus wishes to harm the object. Why? Because anger believes that object is the source of our suffering. Where does anger come from? Like attachment, it comes from our distorted view of reality, particularly this distorted view grasping to independent me, independent objective world. Because then when we see something unpleasant, that seems to be the source of our suffering. And so therefore, get it out of here. And so anger is to be a mental affliction, therefore it's to be fully eliminated. And so attachments, often we have some doubt. We think, well, I need, attachment's actually giving me happy, making me happy sometimes. Whereas anger, we know pretty well that it's something that is quite harmful and we want to really eliminate it. But here also, we have to be careful in terms of how this word anger is used in Buddhism and psychology. We saw that attachment is not really defined in the same way in Buddhism and in psychology. And I think also with anger here is the same. We see here in anger, in Buddhism, there's this intention to harm. And so both anger and attachment are really intentions. Attachment was intention to grab, to hold. And anger is this intention to harm. So like loving kindness and compassion, what we see here is these mental afflictions of attachment and anger are not emotions. So actually Buddhism's not so much focusing on emotions, but what's underneath the emotions, what's driving those emotions. And so that's why we see here both anger and attachment are really looking at that underlying intention level, not the surface emotion level. And I think this is a little bit different here within Buddhism and psychology, because this was really highlighted to me not so long ago. I was reading a book from a well-known psychologist, because here in Buddhism, we say we need to eliminate anger 100%. Whereas in this book, the psychology book I read, the psychologist said, you Buddhists have got it completely wrong. It's not about eliminating anger. It's about having the right type of anger at the right time in the right amount. Because he said, if you don't, how can you deal with difficult situations like social injustice? And so then it became very clear to me that he didn't really appreciate how the word anger was used in Buddhism. We may, in fact, need to use very strong language and behavior in dealing with social injustice, sure. But the key is what's underlying those strong words and actions. If there's an intention to hurt or harm, that's not okay. If the intention is to help, that's compassion. And so here, again, anger is not so much, being red-faced and saying lots of loud words and loud behavior. It's what's driving the behavior that is the key. How to deal with anger? Very similar to with attachment. First, to have a clear understanding of anger, what it is, and how it really does lead to suffering, that we really need to eliminate it. And again, the next step, cultivate the view of genuine happiness. Because if we don't do that, we may have a wish to be free of anger, but then soon as something unpleasant comes our way, aversion or anger will be the natural response, because it will really seem like that person or thing there is really the source of my suffering. So if we can cultivate view of genuine happiness, that's going to be help to stop that reaction. But then when anger is arising, with like attachment, the first step, we need mindfulness. We need to be able to catch anger early before it takes control of our mind. Once it's taken control of our mind and mind is out of control, there's not really much we can do except get out of that situation fast before we say and do things that we're going to regret. So the key is to catch it before it takes control of our mind. So there's, again, a little window of opportunity. We have to notice very early when anger is first arising. And we can only do that if we have cultivated mindfulness through the shamatha practice. Then we can catch anger early and we can simply watch it as it's coming up. And if we watch it, we're free of it. It can't go anywhere. It can't overwhelm us. We don't need to fight with it. We just step back and watch, and it will pass. It will dissipate. And again, in addition to that, we can also apply antidotes to anger. One is patience. So often recommended in Buddhism, if anger is arising, an antidote is patience. But here, patience doesn't mean that we sit there and do nothing and we just sort of try and, hold the anger down. This is not patience. Patience is an undisturbed mind in a difficult situation. So rather than getting angry, we allow the mind to remain calm, because then we can better evaluate the situation and make a better response. But at a deeper level, again, in the Vipassana, emptiness, like attachment, here, through the wisdom of emptiness, if we can investigate that person or thing that seems to be making us angry, where is the unattractiveness there objectively in that person or thing? And like attachment, where we can come to realize that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, we can here realize that the ugliness is in the eye of the beholder. And so therefore, that will dissipate the anger. And so that is another antidote to anger. And so therefore, again, practicing these methods in meditation and then applying them in daily life. And so we'll do as we did earlier this session with attachment, in the beginning of the next session, we'll go through a meditation of dealing with anger. And then also after that meditation, there's also a few misconceptions regarding anger that we need to look at and try to dispel as well. So that's all I wanted to cover in this session. So we've got some time for question answer now. So if you've got any questions, put them in the chat and I'll try and answer them as best I can. So do we have any questions yet?
Yes, Ruthie asks, you suggested to meditate with open eyes, but if it's easier to imagine with closed eyes, shall I close my eyes for the whole meditation?
Right. In general, in meditation, the general recommendation is to have the eyes at least slightly open. And the main reason for that is that with eyes closed, it's easy to fall into dullness and drowsiness. But here, I think, particularly in these more what's called analytical style meditations, where we're doing a lot of active reflecting and visualizing and that, then I think we can be flexible. And so if you find it easier to visualize with the eyes closed and you don't fall into drowsiness, then that's completely okay to do this meditation with the eyes closed. So it really depends a little bit on us as an individual, that if we go eyes closed, do we sort of go off daydreaming? Do we go into sort of dullness? If so, then have the eyes slightly open. But if the eyes open, it's harder to visualize and we get agitated, then we can keep the eyes closed. So we can experiment that and see which works best for us, particularly in these analytical style meditations.
Okay, Noga asks, what if I don't want to harm the object of my anger, but I want it to disappear?
Okay, so the underlying mental affliction, the three poisons, is ignorance, attachment, aversion. So attachment is sort of moving towards something, trying to get it, and aversion is the pushing away, something unpleasant, because it seems like it's a source of our suffering. And that aversion can come in many levels. The sort of very low level might be a sort of a mild irritation, or just a sort of a preference. I sort of prefer actually if it wasn't there. I'm not really okay that it's there. It's sort of, and then we get a little bit of mild irritation for it. Then we start to get a little bit annoyed that it's there. And then it sort of builds and builds, then we might start sort of really actively hating that it's there, and we might get angry if it's a person because they really seem to be causing my suffering. And then at a higher level, we can get into some sort of rage or so forth. So these are all variations of aversion. But the one we're looking at specifically here is anger, where already it's quite strong, the aversion, to the point where now we're wishing to harm the object. At sort of lower levels, there probably is not a wish to harm, but simply just a wish to be separated. So then that wouldn't really be called anger. It would just be called maybe irritation or annoyance or just aversion.
Okay, so Leora asks, is cultivating compassion a necessary condition for cultivating metta unconditional love?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned earlier, actually loving kindness and compassion are sort of the two sides of the same coin. It's really the welfare of ourselves and others. And compassion is focusing on the freedom from suffering perspective, and loving kindness is focusing on the genuine happiness and inner well-being. And as we're going to see tomorrow, we're going to actually combine those two practices into what's called Tonglen. And there we actually take suffering first and then give happiness, because it's difficult. It's a bit awkward to give people happiness when we see them suffering. So the natural response is first, let's take the suffering, and then we sort of help give them happiness. So that's sort of the order we do it in the Tonglen. But actually, again, they're really sort of two sides of the same coin. And so I think it would be, if we're really have genuine compassion, I think then the loving kindness will sort of flow out of that, and vice versa. If we have one or the other one, I think, will come very naturally.
Okay, Iftach wants to know, how do I differentiate pity from compassion? How do I cultivate compassion instead of pity?
Pity is sort of, it's a little bit, self-focused, because it's I'm okay, you're not okay, poor you, tough luck sort of thing. Whereas compassion for others is really 100% focus on that person. So the one key, and that's the same with attachment and loving kindness, is where's your focus? So with the loving kindness attachment question, if you're focused more about me, then it's all about attachment. And here, similarly, if it's sort of more about me, I don't like that, poor you, but I'm okay sort of thing, then that's sort of pity. Whereas compassion is really just focused on the other person. But we'll talk more about that in the context of this selfishness. That'll come tomorrow. So more on that tomorrow. But that's sort of the key element. Where's your focus? Is it more about me, or is it really about that person?
Muli asks, say more about the good angle.
Sorry, the
Can you
question?
please say more about the good angle, good kind of angle?
Good. Yes, that's going to come up in the beginning of the next session. But the short answer is in Buddhism, we wouldn't call it anger. Whereas it seems like the book I read, that he was using anger to also mean using very forceful, strong language and behavior to deal with social injustice. we may need to do that, but if we're doing that based on compassion, then from a Buddhist perspective, we wouldn't call that anger. That would actually be called sort of like forceful compassion. But we'll talk more about that in the next session, beginning of the next session.
Okay.
So there's no such thing as good anger, as the way anger is defined here, because anger is the intention to harm. That's never good.
Thank you. Draw says, it seems that attachment makes you think that objects, people are special, or maybe more special and important. Does eliminating this feeling mean we should see every child as important to our own children, every person as important as our own partner?
Yeah. So a couple of things here. One is that attachment, again, it's all focused on me. And with respect to relationships, if it's 100% attachment sees the other person as a thing, maybe a special thing because it's going to make me happy, but it's all about me. And so that's completely unhealthy, because it's not even seeing the other person as a person. It's seeing it as an object to satisfy me. So that's not healthy. So I've lost the thread of can you say the question again? I lost the second part I was going to say.
Yeah, so the question is, it seems that attachments make you think that objects, people are special, or maybe more special.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So here we talk about seeing everyone as special. In other words, everyone is wanting to be happy. So let's do what we can to help others to be free of suffering and to find happiness. But what we need to be careful of is that, remember, loving kindness and compassion is an aspiration. Often people mistakenly think, if I'm a good Buddhist, then if I really see everyone equally, then I have to spend equal amount of time with everyone. That's complete misconception. What we're talking about here is that loving kindness with our partner would probably translate into maybe intimate behavior and spending a lot of time with them. That same loving kindness to our family members would translate into very different behavior and spending maybe a lot less time with them. That same loving kindness towards our neighbors and work colleagues would translate very differently and maybe spend no time with them. But what we're talking about here is not equal amount of time or equal way of behaving. We're talking about equal attitude, equally wishing everyone to be happy. That we can aspire to. We're not saying, oh, you have to spend the same amount of time with everyone. That would not be actually correct.
Or feasible.
Feasible, or even correct. I mean, that's not, well, it's not possible, but it's also, it wouldn't work. It's not correct, because we have different relationships with different people, and then that loving kindness would express itself depending on the relationship we have with that person. And it may mean we spend no time with them, but that's okay, because we don't have some sort of close relationship with them. But at least we can wish them to be happy equally with everyone. We can do that, or aspire to that. Maybe one more question and then we'll take a break.
Okay, so Hannah asks if you can say more about aversion and anger as being driven from fear.
Actually, we don't see fear as a mental affliction in Buddhism. It doesn't really come up as a separate mental affliction. I think it's another sort of flavor of aversion. And so the whole dynamic comes down to the distorted view of reality, seeing ourselves independent in an independent world. As soon as we make that split, subject-object duality, then naturally when something pleasant happens, we'll want, because that seems to be the source of happiness. Something unpleasant comes our way, push it away, because it seems like that's a source of suffering. And so then all other mental afflictions, I think, including fear and so forth, come out of that dynamic. Maybe the fear comes out of wanting that pleasant, but fearing that I'm not going to get it, or that I'm going to lose it. So fear can come from both of those, fearing that I'm not going to get that person or thing that I desperately need to make me happy, or once I have it, fearing that I'm actually going to lose it because then my life will be finished, sort of thing. Or the opposite, fearing that I'm going to meet with that thing or person that seems to cause me much suffering. And then when I actually meet with it, fearing that it's not going to go away, I'm going to be stuck with it for the rest of my life. So the fear can come out of both of those dynamics. So I think fear is a flavor coming out of that sort of the general dynamic of the attachment and aversion. Okay. So we've run out of time there. So let's leave it there. Let's take a break for 30 minutes again. And in the next session, we'll go on to the third of the 4 immeasurables, empathetic joy. And we'll also finish off dealing with anger first, dispelling some misconceptions about anger. And then I want to really talk about this thing called cognitive fusion. And I think you might find it very helpful in terms of understanding, why do we get angry with people who behave badly, and why is there so much low self-esteem and self-hatred in the modern world? And then we'll go on to look at this empathetic joy after that. But let's take a break, come back in 30 minutes.